want to thank my presenters, or my co-presenters and co-panelists for putting a lot of cards on the table. My experience is both pragmatic and I guess you could say some degree of academic. I have been on executive management in the financial services industry. I've run 2 banks. We've run through a fair amount of crises ourselves. I've also chaired state enterprises, not in Trinidad, in another country. So there were some political niceties that had to be observed. And I've also run through some issues as a government minister, in a sense, which is really it's really about governance. And worse again, I was responsible for the state enterprises. And you could say running state enterprises remotely as a minister does create some unique type of challenges, particularly in a political environment. So I want to put a couple of things on the table. First, I could refer to McKinsey's publication in 2016 when they talked about an age of disruption. And they identified a number of factors which have complicated the environment. One is the issue of globalization. The other, the issue of urbanization. One, the issue of aging. And the fourth and complementary one in terms of the communication sphere was the issue of the internet and the fact that things happen in real time. So that this particular pandemic, we would have been seeing it taking place. So we had some time to prepare. And many people, for example, did not necessarily see it as coming in their direction. And now we understand that it's a worldwide phenomenon. It's going to affect us all. But let me put it in the context that the boards are responsible for not only dealing, if you want, with the total communication with certain spheres of influence and in terms of particular interest groups, not the least of which would be your shareholders and interested third parties, those people who invest money in you. But it's also responsible for setting direction, tone, and tempo of the organization. I want to put that on the table because that's a critical aspect of leadership. And that is different to and distinct from the issue of management, which is responsible for more or less dealing with the complex organization on a daily basis. And by definition, the board will not be able to interface with the organization. It can't, right? By definition. You are, most of the time you're a non-executive director, you are going to be interfacing with managers. So there's a large degree of trust in terms of what is taking place and what messages they send and how you communicate those messages, and by definition, how they pass on that message. And that's particularly true in the times of a crisis. Now, in crisis, the role of the board takes on a slightly different position insofar as it is dealing with, if you want, change, and that's the real role of a board, how to manage change and how to manage the managers in the course of that change. How do you manage the communication? Who becomes the face of the communication? And that's why boards, by definition, don't and can't get involved in detail. But at the same token, they have to be running the ship, if you sense, with a certain degree of remoteness. So it requires touch, what my fellow panelists refer to as some of the soft skills. But it's not necessarily one of the soft skills at all. It is perhaps one of the harder skills, if only insofar as that there's no steering wheel, there's no rudder per se by which you could manage these things, and by definition, therefore, it's always difficult in terms of determining where the direction is. And that's why it's important to talk about timing, tone, and tempo in particular, all right? And that's what the board is responsible for. It's responsible in terms of how it gets that message across, because it's not going to be dealing with the details. By definition, it can't. So it has to complement management so that some of the critical issues are on the table is how those personages interact, the emotional intelligence that is displayed at both levels. And that's the point. That's one of the critical issues I think that's important at this time. I sit on the board of a public company in Trinidad. And one of our biggest issues here is, well, what's a budget? What's the budget? What does the budget mean in this setting, right? Where are we going, right? And you won't be able to tell that because you're not in the field. You have to depend on the executive management to come back. Their job is about managing the complex structure that requires the day-to-day operational perspective. And you have to, in a sense, try to match that with the different sort of a very fluid environment that we are facing, a very fluid environment for the Caribbean in a very real sense of the term, because we are affected. In many ways, our economies are open economies. More than 70 to 80% of our economy is determined by trade, and in fact, by what happens in other countries. So that concept of change is very alive in terms of how you plan for the future, and by definition, therefore, how you communicate that plan both to the interested parties as well as to your stakeholders. Mm-hmm. And how do you determine how you're going to manage, so how you respond to a fluid environment? Mm-hmm. Because in a sense, you see some obvious big picture changes, but you're really determined, or you're really depending on the communication flow between yourself and executive management, and how do you manage that complexity? So there's a dynamic relationship that speaks the interaction between the board and the management, and always has to be handled with a certain degree of delicacy, because the issue of who is stepping into whose areas. But at the same token, the board also has to speak to the stakeholders in the sense of the bigger picture. So you want to have a fair understanding of what takes place. So I stress on the term complementarity, and I stress on the issue of communication, right? And who is communicating what and to whom. And I think that's one of the most important pictures, because the direction has to be that the executive management deals with the communication flow intra-company, and the board has to handle the communication structure insofar as it deals with dealing with the stakeholders. But there is complementarity in terms of how that works. And the two dynamics that are ongoing at all stages of the game are the issue of change and complexity. Management is responsible for interpreting that complexity and putting that complexity in the form of what we consider to be the guiding tools, the budgets, the KPIs and everything else, right? The board has to talk about the direction. Where are we going? How are we going to respond, right? Consider, for example, in every Caribbean island, every Caribbean territory, the management of the healthcare system is very different. So, for example, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, we have regional, if you want, health institutions, but you have a top-down structure in the sense of the minister and a chief health officer. But at the same token, each of the regions have their own difficulties in terms of how bed space and everything else that they have to happen. So the broad picture, the broad communication strategy in terms of dealing with the public is handled by the minister in that concept. But the actual detail on the ground management is handled by the regional authorities and the executive administrators of the hospitals. Same way in the case of the corporate entity, right? That the board handles the bigger picture, the announcements, the numbers, what do the numbers eventually say, but also too in providing the guidance and interpretation of where the organization has to go. And I'll stop at that particular point.